Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal the horrifying scene unfolded as Michael and Wiley stepped out of the Metro Court pool, their earlier evening of relaxation shattered in an instant. The air was warm, a peaceful evening that seemed like the perfect way to wind down after an exhausting week. Neither of them could have anticipated that their calm, quiet night would be abruptly interrupted by violence and dread. As they neared the edge of the pool, something caught Michael's eye. He felt an ice-cold shiver run down his spine. And as he leaned closer, his gaze fixed on something below the surface. What lay at the bottom wasn't just a stray object or debris, it was something far worse. A body. The sight of it left Michael breathless, his heart racing. The lifeless form was eerily still, its weight pressing down against the water, a stark contrast to the ripples of the calm evening. No sign of struggle, no blood in the water, just the chilling, ominous presence of death. Michael's eyes widened in shock. But even more than the grotesque nature of the sight was the unnerving recognition that crept over him. This wasn't just any body. There was something painfully familiar about it. A sense of connection that he couldn't quite shake. His pulse quickened as he realized the implications. The body before him could very well belong to someone he once knew, someone close. Wiley, too, felt the shift in the atmosphere. His young, innocent eyes darted from the body to Michael's face, sensing the change. A cold, suffocating fear overtook him as the realization sank in. This wasn't some unfortunate accident. This was something far more deliberate, a sinister message sent with chilling precision. The air was thick with tension. The horror of the moment consuming them both. Michael stood frozen, unable to tear his eyes away from the figure in the water. The body seemed to stare back at him from beneath the surface. A silent and powerful reminder of something he could not yet fully comprehend. In that moment, everything he had feared about the escalating violence in Port Charles seemed to come rushing back to him. The past few days had been filled with a growing sense of unease. Threats lurking in the shadows, the tension in the air palpable. And now, standing before him was the grim evidence that the darkness that had been creeping into their lives had finally surfaced. Michael couldn't help but recall the events leading up to this terrifying discovery. Just days before, Natalia, once an ally, a contact between Sunny and the underground world of Port Charles, had crashed Daisy's baptism, her presence unexpected and dangerous. The situation had spiraled out of control, with Natalia being detained by the authorities shortly after. It wasn't just a random act. It was part of something larger, a far-reaching conspiracy that Michael had only begun to understand. Sunny, who had once protected Natalia, was now faced with the terrifying possibility that she was caught up in a much darker plot, one orchestrated by Sidwell. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, and the image of the lifeless body in the water seemed to align with the sinister forces pulling the strings in Port Charles. Natalia, caught between loyalty and survival, now found herself at a crossroads. The secrets she carried could cost her everything, her freedom, her life. Sunny, who had once given her protection, was now unsure of where her true allegiances lay. Was she still loyal to the family, or had she become a pawn in Sidwell's dangerous game? The risks she faced were escalating. And the decision she would have to make in the coming days was one that could determine not only her fate but the fate of those she cared about. The unsettling discovery of the body was only the beginning. It was a symbol, a grim warning that no one in Port Charles was safe from the darkness creeping into their lives. Michael's mind raced as he considered the implications. Who was the victim? And more importantly, who was responsible for this brutal act? The answers seemed just out of reach. Hidden in the shadows where Sidwell's influence grew stronger by the day. What was clear, however, was that Michael and his family were now part of something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The stakes had never been higher, and the fight for survival was just beginning. The atmosphere in Port Charles was as tense as a coiled spring, ready to snap at any moment. Just 24 hours earlier, Sonny had sat down with Mayor Laura Collins, someone he trusted to help push back against the ever-growing threat from Sidwell. Sonny's warnings had not come without reason. Sidwell's continuous threats to destabilize everything Sonny had worked for over the years had only added to the pressure. The stakes had never been higher, and the tension had reached a boiling point. Sonny had made it clear that he would not sell the pier to Sidwell, a decision that had only deepened the rift between them. But deep inside, Sonny could feel something dark, something ominous, looming on the horizon. Even though he had no solid proof to connect Sidwell to the bombing of his penthouse, Sonny couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that Sidwell was somehow behind it. The fear was palpable, and with each passing day, the danger grew closer, more undeniable. The tension in Port Charles didn't just end there. Later that same evening, following Daisy's baptism, things escalated even further. A Molotov cocktail was thrown into the back of Charlie's pub, the explosion sending a massive wave of fire rippling through the area. The flames spread quickly, causing significant damage to the building and the surrounding area. Chaos erupted as the fire raged. And in the middle of the frenzy, Christina found herself trapped, caught in the thick of it all. Her heart raced as she struggled to find a way out, but the smoke and the panic overwhelmed her. Thankfully, she emerged unscathed physically, but the psychological scars of that night would take much longer to heal. The emotional toll of being caught in such a violent act left her shaken to the core. For Sonny and his family, it was a harsh reminder of the constant danger they lived under. A threat that never seemed to ease but only intensified. The shadows of violence had come knocking once again. Yet, the situation grew more complicated when whispers began circulating about Natalia's involvement in a much darker plot. It became clear that Natalia, once a trusted ally who had worked as a link between Sonny and the underground world, was now walking a dangerous line. She had already made questionable choices. But this latest development raised the stakes even higher. There was a strong possibility that she had trusted Michael enough to share secrets she had been carrying, secrets that should have remained buried. The depth of her trust in Michael could very well have been her undoing. By revealing critical information to him, she might have unknowingly signed her own death warrant. The implications were chilling. If Natalia had disclosed vital details to Michael, possibly about Sidwell's plans or even his true intentions, she could have put herself in grave danger. Michael, though not fully aware of the intricacies of Natalia's dealings, had always been astute. He could sense that something was off, that a storm was brewing. And with his sharp instincts, he knew that something far more sinister was unfolding. A death like the one they had discovered earlier wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. It was part of a much larger, far-reaching plot. Sonny's worst fears were beginning to take shape, and the worst part was that he couldn't fully protect everyone he cared about. As much as he tried to shield his family, the web of deceit and treachery was growing tighter, with threats coming from every direction. Natalia, once a pawn in the game, was now playing a dangerous part in it, unknowingly feeding into Sidwell's schemes. And as the clock ticked down, every moment felt like one step closer to an inevitable confrontation. Sonny could no longer stand idly by. The stakes had risen, and with his family in the line of fire, Sonny was preparing for the most dangerous fight of his life, unsure of who to trust and who would be left standing when it was all over. As the pieces of this sinister puzzle fell into place, the tension in Port Charles was becoming unbearable. Who could be trusted? Was Natalia truly on their side? Or had she become another pawn in Sidwell's twisted game? Sonny knew that time was running out, and soon. All of Port Charles would be forced to face the consequences of the dark forces that had infiltrated their lives. The violence and destruction were only the beginning. What came next would shake the very foundations of everything Sonny had worked to protect. Under the looming threat of Sidwell, Marco found himself caught in a treacherous political and violent game that he couldn't escape. The world he had once known, built on loyalty and alliances, was rapidly crumbling around him. Sidwell, with his power and manipulation, had woven a web that entangled Marco in ways he never imagined. Marco's involvement in this dangerous game was becoming inevitable. Whether he chose to play along willingly or was forced into it, there seemed to be no way out. Sidwell's cunning mind had set a plan into motion that made it nearly impossible for Marco to back away. Every move Marco made seemed to draw him deeper into Sidwell's grasp, where choices were no longer his to make. The violence and the threats had escalated, and now Marco found himself walking a razor-thin line between survival and destruction. Meanwhile, Michael's relationship with Sonny and the family was becoming increasingly strained. The tension between them was palpable. As Michael realized just how deep the chasm between family loyalty and survival was growing. If Sidwell's plan was indeed to set a trap for Sonny, forcing him to take action against Natalia, then the body discovered under the water at the Metro Court pool was more than just a grisly murder, it was a message. A chilling part of Sidwell's broader strategy. The death was deliberate. A calculated move meant to provoke, to stir emotions, and to force Sonny into a corner where there would be no way out. Michael's heart raced as the implications of this grew clearer. His father was being pulled into a trap, and the family was being torn apart from the inside out. Marco's role in this was becoming ever more complex. It was entirely possible that he had inadvertently become an ally to Sidwell, dragged into a conspiracy that was spiraling out of control. His hesitation, his indecision, made him vulnerable to manipulation, and Sidwell had expertly played to those weaknesses. Marco might not have signed up to be part of this web of lies and deceit. But now, with every passing moment, his actions, whether intentional or not, were aiding Sidwell's cause. Marco was a pawn in a game he never asked to play, and the stakes were becoming deadly. His involvement, whether by design or by circumstance, could very well be the catalyst for the next wave of violence to engulf Port Charles. The question remained, how deep was Marco into this now? Was there any way for him to free himself, or was he forever bound to Sidwell's machinations? The discovery of the body in the pool was a wake-up call. Not just for Michael but for everyone in Port Charles. It was a stark reminder of the violence that Sidwell was willing to bring to the city, a symbol of the storm that was brewing in the distance. The peace that had once existed in Michael's life and family seemed like a distant memory now. What was once a tight-knit group was now on the brink of disintegration. As each new revelation threatened to pull them further apart. Every step they took felt like it was being watched, scrutinized by the forces working in the shadows. Trust was a luxury they could no longer afford, and paranoia had settled in like a constant companion. Sidwell's rising influence was undeniable. With each attack, each act of violence, his power seemed to grow stronger, and Port Charles was rapidly falling into a state of chaos. What had once been a city of power struggles and rivalries had now become a battleground for survival, where no one was safe, and no one could predict who would be the next target. Michael, Sonny, and their families were fighting to maintain control of their lives. But every move they made seemed to push them further into danger. The question that weighed heavily on Michael's mind was whether Sonny could protect them all. The threat was no longer distant, it was right at their doorstep. Sidwell had shown that he was capable of anything, and the loss of control over their own fates was terrifying. The revelations surrounding Natalia's involvement only added to the pressure. Her secrets, her knowledge of the underground dealings, could be the key to unraveling everything. But who would bear the consequences of her choices? Would she be able to keep her past hidden, or would her actions lead to the family's destruction? The body at the bottom of the pool was not just an isolated incident, it was a harbinger of the war that was about to erupt. The game was shifting. And Port Charles was on the verge of being engulfed by it. The violence that had already begun was only a prelude to what was coming. As Sonny, Michael, and the rest of the family scrambled to piece together what remained of their lives, they were forced to confront the fact that this was just the beginning. A storm was on the horizon. And they were all caught in its path. Would they survive the coming conflict, or would the weight of betrayal and violence crush them once and for all? The answers were uncertain. But one thing was clear, the battle for survival in Port Charles had only just begun, and it was going to be more brutal than any of them could have anticipated. The weight of the impending storm was almost unbearable. Port Charles, a city once known for its mix of danger and luxury, was now teetering on the edge of total chaos. The peaceful veil that had once cloaked the Corinthos family's life had been ripped away, revealing a brutal truth: survival in this world was no longer a given. Michael, still grappling with the aftermath of the body discovered at the bottom of the Metro Court pool, found himself questioning everything he had ever known. Every move felt like a step closer to a precipice, where one wrong choice could cost him everything. The bond that had once existed between him and Sonny, his father, was unraveling by the day. As the brutal reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. Sonny had always been the rock, the steady hand guiding them through turbulent waters, but now even he seemed uncertain. Vulnerable in ways he had never been before. The lines between right and wrong had blurred beyond recognition, and the stakes had risen to a level that neither Michael nor Sonny were prepared for. The discovery of the body in the pool wasn't just a grisly death, it was a symbol of everything that was unraveling in their lives. It was a stark reminder of the lengths Sidwell was willing to go to. Every day, the walls were closing in, and Sidwell's influence was spreading like a dark, invasive shadow over Port Charles. The violence had escalated. Not just with the bomb that had rocked Charlie's pub but with the psychological toll it was taking on everyone involved. Christina, still recovering from the terror she had experienced, was only the beginning. The Corinthos family had been forced to confront the brutal reality that the violence would not stop, it would only escalate, and soon, there would be no place left to hide. Sidwell, a man with his own ambitions, had expertly manipulated everyone around him. Marco, once a man of loyalty and honor, had been drawn into Sidwell's web of deceit and violence. And now it seemed there was no turning back. Marco had never intended to be a part of this war, but with every passing day, he found himself sinking deeper into the chaos. His hesitation, his reluctance to take a stand, had made him an unwitting ally to Sidwell. His once clear sense of right and wrong had been obscured by the political and criminal forces at play. Now, as the situation grew more dangerous, Marco realized the terrifying truth: he was caught in a storm he couldn't escape. Every decision he made seemed to have consequences he hadn't anticipated. And soon, he would have to choose between his survival and his loyalty. Michael, too, felt the pressure mounting. The bond between him and his father had always been strong, but now, the foundation of that relationship was being tested in ways that felt irreparable. As the realization hit that Sidwell's ultimate plan might be to force Sonny into taking action against Natalia, the gravity of the situation became clear. The body in the pool wasn't just a warning, it was the first move in a much larger, more dangerous game. Sidwell wanted to tear apart the Corinthos family. To make them question their every move, and to force them into making decisions that would have irreversible consequences. If Natalia's involvement in this mess was true, it would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Michael had trusted her, perhaps too much, and now it seemed as though the weight of her secrets was about to crush them all. Natalia, once a trusted ally, was now a wild card, a person whose knowledge of the darker corners of Port Charles could bring both salvation and destruction. She had been walking a fine line, caught between her loyalty to the family and the growing pressure from Sidwell. Had she made a terrible mistake by confiding in Michael? Had she exposed herself to the very man she had been trying to escape? The tragic truth was, her decision to trust Michael could very well be what led to her downfall. Port Charles had been forced into a new reality. It was no longer a city of quiet intrigue and power struggles, it had become a battlefield. The once solid alliances were now fractured. And every family member had to make choices they were not prepared for. Sonny, ever the protector, found himself struggling to keep his family together in the face of overwhelming threats. The darkness Sidwell had unleashed was like a storm, and it was swallowing them whole. With each passing moment, the danger grew. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before. And Sonny knew he could no longer fight this battle alone. His actions, no matter how well-intentioned, had set this chain of events in motion. Every decision, every secret, had led them here, and now the consequences were inescapable. The question of whether Sonny could protect his family weighed heavily on him. The threats from Sidwell were only the beginning. There were too many unknowns, too many variables to keep track of. Natalia's secrets, Marco's entanglement with Sidwell. The body in the pool, all of it pointed to something far more sinister than just a family in peril. This wasn't just about survival, it was about their very identities. Would they still be the people they had once been? Or would they be irreparably changed by the forces pulling them in every direction? As Michael and Sonny stood on the precipice of this impending war, they knew the battle wasn't just for survival, it was for their souls. They had to decide who they could trust, what they were willing to sacrifice, and how far they were willing to go to protect those they loved. The stakes were impossibly high, and there was no turning back. The storm that was brewing over Port Charles would change everything. The body under the pool was just the first sign of a war that would reshape the city and everything it stood for. The ultimate question remained, would they emerge from the ashes as a family, or would the weight of the betrayals and the bloodshed break them forever? As the violence and intrigue continued to unfold, one thing was certain, nothing in Port Charles would ever be the same again.